Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. In today's episode, Toan finally faces his past and reports the attack that took away his memory, while Tu Diem comes face to face with the fear of losing him forever. And now, let's continue exploring the story of Toan and Tu Diem. As the truth slowly comes to light, will peace truly return to their lives? If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. In the morning, the red dirt path leading to the garden still carried familiar footprints. Tu Diem walked slowly, her bare feet touching the ground she had known for years. The bamboo basket hanging at her side swayed gently with each step. Ahead was a small garden, rows of cabbages lined up neatly, green leaves still holding traces of dew. The woman selling vegetables stood there, hands on her hips, her face showing fatigue, but her eyes still kind. Tu Diem spoke politely, asking whether the cabbages were still young or already tightly formed. The woman answered calmly, pointing briefly toward a nearby plot before turning back. They exchanged a few short sentences. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. Tu Diem decided to buy one bundle. The woman nodded and handed her a knife. The blade cut through the cabbage stalks with a crisp sound. Each head fell heavily onto the ground. Tu Diem cut them herself, lifted them one by one, and placed them carefully into her basket, counting quietly as she worked. When she finished, the woman said the price would be 60,000 jong. Tu Diem handed over the money, her fingers trembling slightly with quiet joy, thanking her again and again. The woman waved as Tu Diem walked away, her figure slowly disappearing behind the bamboo fence. That morning felt ordinary, yet for Tu Diem it carried a sense of relief. She took a deep breath. Inside her was a fragile hope. A new day had begun through simple actions, through honest exchange between people who were not close, yet treated each other with trust. The village road was covered with fine red dust. Tu Diem walked more slowly now. The bamboo basket had grown heavy, the cabbages stacked neatly, green leaves standing out clearly. She began to call out to sell them, her voice not loud, but steady and clear. Sweat ran down her temples and soaked into her shirt, yet her eyes remained patient. An elderly woman stopped her bicycle, bent down to look, then bought one cabbage. Tu Diem accepted the crumpled 10,000 dong note, her hand shaking slightly. She continued walking and calling out. A young man slowed his motorbike, asked the price, then bought 2 cabbages. His laugh faded as the engine sound disappeared down the road. Tu Diem paused briefly and watched him go. A quiet sense of relief spread through her chest. Each bill she received was not just money. It was a small piece of hope for tomorrow, for the modest house, for the man waiting at home. A breeze passed through the fields, carrying the scent of soil and freshly cut cabbage leaves. Even though she was tired, she kept walking. She believed that these simple efforts would lead her back to a safe, peaceful place. When Tu Diem returned home, the sun had already climbed higher. In the yard, the steady sound of a shovel scraping against gravel echoed. Toan stood in the middle of the yard, his shirt smeared with dirt, his hands gripping the shovel as he cleared old gravel from the corner of the house. Hearing familiar footsteps, he looked up, the corner of his mouth lifting into a small smile. Tu Diem set the basket down without speaking. She walked over to the tool area, picked up the remaining shovel and handed it to him. They began working together without discussion. Shovels moved earth, gravel rolled aside, a bamboo broom swept dust away. Each of them took on a task naturally, as if they had done this many times before. They spoke softly. This spot for the stove. that corner for pots and bowls to keep things tidy. Tu Diem swept while Toan leveled the ground. Sweat soaked through their clothes, but every movement brought a sense of relief. It felt as though they were rebuilding a small part of their life, piece by piece. As the afternoon passed, Tu Diem lifted her head and looked at Toan. The man who had once been lost, who had once lain motionless on the road, now stood firmly in front of her. No words were needed. Their eyes met, and that was enough. The work was rough, the tools were few, but that made their closeness even clearer. They worked in silence, standing close, as if the world had narrowed to this small yard and two people determined not to let go. When the bamboo broom finally stopped, Tu Diem remained holding its handle. Her gaze rested on Toan, though she avoided looking directly into his eyes. The air suddenly felt heavy. She bit her lip and asked quietly about the two men from a few days earlier, asking what he planned to do. Toan stopped. He planted the shovel into the ground and turned toward her. His eyes carried wounds that had not yet healed. Tu Diem took a deep breath and continued. During the time he had lost his memory, she had thought a great deal. She feared that the person behind everything might have been his own mother. The words landed heavily. Toan remained silent for a long time. Then he nodded slightly and said he had thought the same. There was no anger on his face, only deep sadness, as if an old wound had been touched once again. Tu Diem stepped closer and lightly touched his hand, not to comfort him, but to share the pain. They stood there in the yard as the day slowly faded. No tears fell. Yet in every breath lived the fear of losing each other again and a fragile hope that this time they would not turn away. The yard gradually returned to stillness after the work was done. The ground bore uneven shovel marks, firm enough to walk on, but not yet smoothed out. Damp earth clung lightly to the soles of their feet. The faint smell of old gravel lingered in the air, mixed with the scent of soil that had been turned over again after many days. Tu Diem leaned the bamboo broom carefully against the wall. She did not move right away. She stood there, shoulders slightly tense, as if allowing every word that had just been spoken to settle deep inside her. Her breathing slowed, one breath at a time. Toan remained standing where he was. Both hands rested on the shovel handle. His shoulders were steady, but his gaze stayed fixed on the ground as though he was weighing something heavy in his mind. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but thick with thought. After a long moment, he finally spoke. His voice was low and even. There was no hesitation in it, no anger, no rush. He said he would go to the local police station. He would explain everything clearly, step by step. The missing motorbike, the two men who had attacked him, the blow that came from behind, the days when his memory vanished, leaving only confusion and fear behind. He said he did not want conflict. He did not want noise. He only wanted things handled properly, in the right way, so they could move forward without looking over their shoulders again. As Tu Diem listened, the tightness in her chest loosened slightly. Fear was still there. It had not disappeared. But it no longer pressed down with the same weight. It became something she could carry, rather than something that crushed her. She stepped closer to him without thinking. Toan lifted one hand and placed it gently on her shoulder. The touch was light, but it was firm enough to be felt. It carried intention. He told her he would not allow anyone to hurt her again. He told her he would protect her and protect the quiet life they were trying to rebuild together, piece by piece. Tu Diem lowered her head. Tears slid down her cheeks slowly. She did not wipe them away. They were not tears of despair. They came from relief, from the first clear feeling of safety she had felt in days. Toan drew her into his arms and held her close. His embrace was steady and grounded. There was no trembling in it, only resolve. For a brief moment, the small yard felt warmer, even as the evening air began to cool around the house. The wind brushed against the walls, but inside that space, the two of them stood firm, sharing the same quiet understanding. They stayed like that for a while. No words were spoken. Both of them knew the road ahead would not be simple. Nothing had truly ended yet. There were still unanswered questions, still risks, still things they could not control. But they had chosen to face what came next together without turning away. Later, they went to the local police station side by side. The station was small and quiet. An old wooden desk stood in the center of the room, its surface worn smooth by years of use. Above it, a ceiling fan turned steadily, its low hum filling the space with a sense of order. The air felt cool and still. Toan sat across from Thu. His hands rested flat on the table. His fingers tightened briefly, then relaxed as he began to speak. His voice remained calm and clear. He described everything carefully. How the motorbike went missing, how the two men appeared without warning, how the blow from behind sent him into darkness, how the days that followed existed only as blank spaces in his memory. He did not exaggerate, he did not raise his voice. He spoke only of what had happened, nothing more. Tu Diem sat beside him in silence. Her posture was straight. Her eyes never left his face. It was as if her presence anchored him there, reminding him that the present was real, that he was no longer alone in it. Thu listened attentively. He took notes by hand, occasionally asking a short question to clarify a detail. His tone remained calm and professional, without judgment. When Toan mentioned the young woman who had brought the motorbike to the authorities, Thu stood up and walked toward the storage area behind the office. His footsteps echoed softly on the concrete floor. A moment later, he returned, pushing the familiar motorbike into the room. The white and red body rolled forward slowly. The sound of the tires against the floor seemed louder in the quiet space. Thu stopped beside the desk and opened the storage compartment. Inside were the documents, the helmet, the old jacket. Everything was still there, nothing was missing. The atmosphere in the room shifted almost immediately. It became lighter, calmer. Toan reached out and rested his hand on the handlebar. The cool metal felt solid beneath his palm. Familiar, reassuring, like something that had been taken away was now being returned to where it belonged. He signed the handover form carefully. His handwriting was steady. Thu explained that the investigation would continue and that they would be contacted once there were results. His voice was firm, giving weight to his words. Tu Diem released a quiet breath she had not realized she was holding. Beneath the table, she reached for Toan's hand and held it. The grip was gentle but sure. Toan turned slightly to look at her. She nodded once. That was enough. They stepped outside together. The iron gate opened with a familiar creaking sound. The motorbike was pushed out into the open. Toan paused for a moment, running his hand along the handlebar once more, as if confirming that it was truly there. The metal felt cool and real beneath his fingers. Thu handed over the remaining paperwork and gave a few quiet reminders. They thanked him sincerely, without unnecessary words. Toan put on the helmet. Tu Diem stood close, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder, grounding the moment. The engine started, steady and familiar. Tu Diem climbed onto the back of the bike and wrapped her arms around his waist. Her cheek rested lightly against his back. The motorbike rolled forward, leaving the station behind and moving onto the familiar village road. The wind passed by, carrying the scent of dry soil and roadside grass. They did not speak as they rode home. The silence between them felt complete, full rather than empty. With every turn of the wheels, one truth became clearer. They had chosen this path together. And this time, no matter what lay ahead, they would not let each other be lost again.
Sau những biến cố liên tiếp, Toan và Tu Diem dần đối diện với sự thật khi Toan quyết định lên công an trình báo toàn bộ sự việc, từ việc mất xe, bị tấn công đến quãng thời gian mất trí nhớ. Tu Diem luôn ở bên, lặng lẽ nhưng kiên định.